Okay, so today we're going to talk about rendering the scene and also rendering using layers to get the ambient occlusion layer. So to start off, I have the scene finished here. I have the HDRI light, I have the model with all the textures applied, and then I have my area light set up the way I want. And so let's just do a few steps here before we get started with the rendering layers. So the HDRI map that I have here, I want to make sure that I have it selected over here in my outliner window, or you can just select it by clicking here. I want to just go to the attribute editor and scroll down to check under this visibility tab under the attribute editor. By default, the camera will be set to 1 under visibility. And if you just slide it to 0, it'll still continue to cast light just the way it's supposed to onto the scene, but just when you render it, it won't come through in your render, which will help out a lot, because if you don't have any models in the scene behind here, this will become an alpha channel that you can kind of work with in Photoshop and composite in whatever background that you want into the scene. And it'll just kind of get out of the way a little bit. So I just selected the sky dome, went to the attribute editor, scrolled down to visibility, and then I just took the camera slider all the way down to 0 here. So now that's done, let's see, it's time to set up a camera. Let's see here. So I already set up a camera, so I'll just delete that. Okay, so to set up a camera, just go to Create, Cameras, and then this top option, Camera, that's got the yellow icon on it. And so from here, nothing really changed. The camera got created kind of within the model, I'm guessing. Yeah, you can kind of see it right there. And so what I want to do is I want to go on my perspective view, go to the top under Panels. So Panels, Perspective, and Camera right here. So Panels, Perspective, and Camera, and if I click on that, my perspective view will change to the camera view. And it'll appear as black because the camera is just inside the model right now. So I'll select the model, press F to focus on it, and start to position it here. Something I like to do when I'm positioning it is to click the resolution gate, which is where my cursor is right now, just so we can see how this thing's framed up. I can see, so right now it looks like my scene is set up as some kind of film format, like a 1920 by 10, oh, here we are, 960 by 540, so that's the default. And so for this render, I think kind of more of a square composition will be good. But either way, I need to boost up these settings, because 960 by 540 is not going to cut it here. So go up to this button right here, this render button with the gear on it. That's render settings. So where my cursor is right there is the render settings button. So I'll click on that, and we're going to be kind of working in this tab some here today. So we have render using, and this is correct. By default, it'll have Arnold Renderer, which is what we want. So just make sure that that's what's selected. And first, I'm just going to worry about this common tab, and then later on, we're going to worry about this Arnold Renderer tab here. So for the common tab, I just want to scroll down. I want to go ahead and make the renderable camera the camera that we just created there. But the main thing I want to do here is the image size. So HD 540 is the default preset, and it's 960 pixels by 540, which is basically like an HD format that, you know, so film and television was shot in a format similar to this back in 2005 and prior. And it's helpful for previewing your renders while you're kind of composing your scene, but for a final export, it's not going to be good. It's just going to be too small to end up in your portfolio and all that stuff. So our goal here is to export an image that's going to look nice enough, you know, that it'll hopefully be able to be an option in your portfolio. So there's a few options you can do here. Just moving it up to HD 1080 doubles the size to 1920 by 1080, and that's a good format. But with these presets, all these presets are different width and height dimensions there. So for this, I might want to go 2K square, so it's basically even a little bit larger than that. So it's 2048 by 2048. I feel like this image lends itself pretty well to a square composition here. So that's what I'm going to go with. So I'll close this out. And now I want to pull up the Arnold Render view so that I can just kind of see how this render is coming out with the camera and reposition the camera as needed. So it just needs to think about that for a moment. Oh, I have 3D manipulation on right now. And so 3D manipulation, if you go to, in the Arnold Render view, if you go to Windows, 3D manipulation, it means that you can kind of move the camera from your render view, which can be super helpful, but it's not really what I need right now. So from here, I'm just going to frame up things up here. For the camera, the focal length is at 35. I'm gonna bring it up to 50. Might even experiment with something a little higher. 50 to 85 focal length is kind of the focal length that photographers typically use for a portrait photograph. And so in this instance, I'm not really trying to, a wide angle lens is better for capturing a larger scene, like a long shot in a film. And so, you know, I don't have like a full scene, I just have a model that I'm trying to get here. So a focal length of 50 to 85 is pretty good. So let's see here, just gonna zoom in a little, and that looks good for my render. So once you kind of find the focal length and the camera position that you want to use, I suggest locking your camera, which is this little button up here where my cursor is in the top left of your camera view, right there. So I'll press that, and now the camera's locked in. So I'm just going to save the scene before I start really rendering here. So okay, so there's kind of two steps that we want to do here with the rendering. Is we're going to render the main pass that'll look something like this, but just a little, you know, more high res and all that good stuff. And then we're going to render an ambient occlusion pass to go on top of that. And the ambient occlusion pass is something that you're definitely going to want to use in the future. It basically renders out a white version of this that is lit pretty evenly, but it darkens the areas, the crevices in the model, and the areas where the model intersects with the ground. And so, and we'll composite it in Photoshop and use the multiply layer mode to do so. And it'll just kind of help your image pop and get it looking a little more realistic here. And it's a very common tool to use in an animation or rendering pipeline here. So I'm just going to stop this render for a sec. So we're going to set up those renders here. So the way to set up these renders is by going to this render layer button right here next to the hypershade. And so if you click on that, and again, it's this button right here. If you click on that, this window will come up. And so what I want to do, I'm just trying to think here for a second. Before I do that, before we do that, let's change the render settings on this to be, no, I'm sorry. Feeling indecisive here, sorry. Go to render layers, and I'm going to create two render passes. And the reason we need to do two render passes is the ambient occlusion is a whole new shader that we need to set up in Maya. And it's very simple, but as you might recall, if I go to the hypershade window, we already set up this shader network for our main render. And so an ambient occlusion will kind of replace that whole thing. And so for that reason, we're just going to set up a separate render pass where we render the two shaders separately here. So this will make more sense as we move along here. And so back in this render layers button right here, this kind of works a bit like Photoshop, but let me just walk you through the steps here. So we'll click this button, and that's create a render layer. And I'm just going to call this the color pass, or the main pass. Let's see. And so again, I've only clicked that button right there, renamed it, and now I'm going to right click and let's see here. Create collection is what we want. So it's the very first option. So I again, right click, create collection. This will show up. And you'll see this whole window shows up. And so what we're going to do here is we're going to select everything that we want to be in this render layer, which in this instance is everything. So, and I'll just click right there to bring it back up. So for here, it helps to have your outliner open. So if your outliner is not open to the left there, just go to Windows and Outliner right there to get it open. Having the outliner open is going to be really helpful here. So just select everything in your scene by holding Shift and Select. And then just over here, under the collection, just press Add. So press that. Everything got added into the scene here. So that's great. And so once we want to render this render layer, we'll just press this visibility button, and that render layer will become what is rendered when we render this out. So now what we need to do is we need to set up the ambient occlusion pass. So very similar process. There's just going to be 2 added steps here, I think. So we're going to create a new render layer and then call this ambient occlusion. So we have a new render layer that we named. Then same thing, going to right click and go to create collection, the very first option under the right click menu. And here, this is where things start to change, is I'm not going to select any of the lights in the scene. All I want are whatever objects that are going to be rendered in the scene. So right here in my scene, I just have the tree and the plane. I believe neither of which I really named here. So it's going to be pdisk 1 and then pplane 1. In the future, definitely name those though. That was a mistake on my part. So with those 2 selected, press Add. So just those 2 objects are added to the scene here. And so, because we don't need the lights because the ambient occlusion is going to kind of do its own lighting thing here. So now we need to add the ambient occlusion to this render layer. So I'm going to right click on the collection now. So before I right clicked on ambient occlusion, now I'm going to right click on collection 2. And we're going to go down to, we're looking for create material override here. So click on create material override, and we'll have this kind of come up on the right here. And so we'll want to click this checkerboard button. And so from here, we're going to look for the ambient occlusion shader. So the ambient occlusion shader is under Arnold Shaders, and it's the very top one here. So not under Maya, but under Arnold, under Shaders, the top option, AI, ambient occlusion is what we want. So just click on that. And so now for that render layer, the ambient occlusion shader got added onto those objects. And so I'll just click, we're basically done now. So we just click that visibility button so that when it renders, it'll come up. I'll pull up my Arnold Render view. And you see here, just having to think about it just for a second here, but it renders out a white version of the scene. And the reason that this is black back here is that's an alpha channel. So if we open this up in Photoshop, that's fine, you know. It'll just come up as a transparent background right there. So what you can kind of see this ambient occlusion is doing is it's just like a white render. And what we're looking for is just kind of these dark areas in here to help define the objects a bit better. So if we look over, I'm just going to close some things out. In the hypershade, we have the ambient occlusion kind of showed up as its own shader up here. So we have our original shader network down here, but we have the ambient occlusion shader network here. And with the ambient occlusion selected right here with this node, is if we look under property editor, we have all these attributes here. And the main attribute to worry about is the samples. It'll just increase the quality of the shader to get to that kind of final render setting that we want. You should experiment too with spread, fall off, near clip, far clip, white and black. So this will just kind of help adjust the way the darks and the lights kind of work here. So, oops. Let me just close out the hypershade. So, things slipped and kind of changed. I need to let this blue bar update to see how this thing's going to go. All right, my computer's running a little slow today. By a little, I mean a lot. Okay. There we go. I think by mistake I must have dragged a slider there. So near clip, far clip is the distance that the ambient occlusion works on. So that'll be more helpful for larger scenes. For a project like this, you're definitely not going to need to worry about that typically. So you can see kind of what the spread slider's doing. I typically like that all the way up. Fall off kind of blows it out a little bit more. Again, this kind of has the amount of detail that I want. And then white and black kind of works like the levels control in Photoshop a little bit. So for all these are basically what I want here. But that's definitely something you can mess around with. But for me, the main thing I usually mess around with here is the samples. By default, is at 3. You want them to be from 8 to 10 is usually going to be pretty good. And so with that done, let's just close that out because my computer's taking forever here. So just take the samples up to 8 to 9, 10, somewhere in that range to kind of get the render quality up there. And so now we're almost done. We just need to boost up the render settings for our final render here. So if you recall, so I clicked this render settings button here with the gear on it, and we had made the camera renderable, and then I changed my preset to the 2K square option, and that's all we've done so far. And so go now from the common tab to the Arnold Renderer tab. And so from here, we just have a few controls that we can boost up. So we have the camera AA, which is kind of like an anti-aliasing thing. And you're going to just want this to be a little bit higher. Keep in mind that all of these sliders here, these numbers are really low, which is fine. And it's a little bit goes a long way in terms of adjusting these sliders. So if I were to move this up from 2 to 3, it's not linear where it's moving it from a quality of 2 out of 10 to 3 out of 10. It's taking the quality and then multiplying it, like squaring it basically. So when you go from 2 to 3, that's actually a really big difference in the quality, if that makes sense. So you don't need to boost these up to like 10 or anything like that. It's just nice to start off with just boosting up diffuse and specular and the camera AA up a notch. And it kind of just depends how much you move these sliders. It depends on how good your computer is and how much it can handle here. And with Arnold, it kind of depends on your scene how you want to boost these up. So for this tree right now, you're always going to want the camera AA to be up for your final render. We have our diffuse colors, right? That was our color map and all that stuff. So we want that quality to be up. We want specularity quality to be up because we applied a specular map, and so that's a big part of our model. The transmission is transparency. So in my scene, I don't have any glass in the scene, so there's no reason for me to boost that up. SSS stands for subsurface scattering, and subsurface scattering has to deal with light that enters into the model and bounces around and comes out. So that's if we're making a character with kind of human skin or wax or something like that, where light can kind of get go into the object and bounce around and come out, is where that comes up. And so we didn't apply subsurface scattering here, so we don't have to worry about that. And volume indirect has to deal with light bouncing and how many times the light bounces within the scene here. So I might just boost that one up. So that's all we've changed right there. And for this, we don't really need to worry about much else. Adaptive sampling is something, if you enabled it, it's really good for preview renders, but for your final render, if you do have this enabled, just disable that right there. So that's good disabled. So last thing we need to do is, if you remember in kind of rendering in Maya, I guess I'm not, let's see here, the quality of the shadows with ray tracing kind of boosts up the quality, and that's the same here with Arnold rendering. So I just want to select each of my lights, and I'll do this one by one. So I have 1, 2, 3, 4 lights, and then I have my HDRI light. And we're just going to want to boost the samples and the shadows for each one. So I selected my key light right there. And then I'm just scrolling down a little bit. So it's right here, it's samples. And so don't do volume samples, that's not what we want. So again, just kind of, it's underneath the main color intensity exposure attributes, just right here under samples. Let's just boost that up from 1 to 2 on each of these lights here. So samples 1 to 2, samples 1 to 2. I'm just selecting each light here and just boosting it up for each one. And then I'm going to do it for the HDRI Skydome light here as well. Here it is, samples, just bring it up 1 to 2. So now we're ready to go. Everything should be good to go here. And so for the final render, I actually don't typically use the Arnold Render view for this. I'll kind of close that out, and I will use this render view, the kind of traditional render view. And so click on this eyeball button right there, and this window will come up. I'm going to change that to raw up here. And so, yeah, so change that from ACES to raw. And that won't change the output of the render, but it'll just make it so what appears on your screen is actually accurate, because ACES is not accurate. So it'll kind of make your image look brighter than it actually is. So this should hopefully come out accurately here. So in order to render here, I just need to, typically you would press this button right here, but that's actually not what we want to do right now because we had set up a camera. So since I'd set up a camera, I'm going to go to Render at the top here, to Render, and then I'm going to click Camera 1. So I'm going to leave that up for a second. So Render, Render, Camera 1. And once I click that, the render is going to start. But before I do that, I just real quick need to go back to my render layers, which is this button right here. Is next to the hypershade. And you remember we created our main pass and our ambient occlusion pass. So right now my ambient occlusion is selected with that I button pressed on. And I'm okay with that. I'm okay kind of doing the ambient occlusion pass first here. So the ambient occlusion pass is going to render. This is going to take a while because this we've boosted up these render settings to a high setting here. So don't be surprised if these renders take 10 to 20 minutes on your computer, maybe even a little more, a little less, give or take here. So render, render camera, and we're going to do the ambient occlusion pass here. Okay, so the ambient occlusion pass rendered. So the first thing I want to do is I just want to press this keep image button right here. That'll temporarily save the image so that, just to make sure we don't lose it here. You'll see the slider came up. So I cut away, but it looks like that render took about 4 minutes here. So 4 minutes is what my ambient occlusion pass took. It's going to take a little bit longer for the other render here. So what I want to do here is I want to just go ahead and save this. So I'm going to go File, Save Image, and then I'm just going to navigate to the Images folder in my project. And I want this to be a PSD. So I'm going to make this a PSD in terms of the file type. And I'm just going to call this Stump AO for Ambient Occlusion version 1, and save that. Okay, and let's just, before we do anything else, I'm just going to get a Photoshop open here on my computer. But let's go ahead and set up the other render pass. So if I go back to Maya and go back to this render layers button right here that's next to the hypershade. So for the render layers, I'm going to turn off the ambient occlusion render pass, and then I'm going to turn on our main pass right there. And I might go ahead and start that render here because this is going to take a minute. So, sorry, Photoshop just opened. Okay, so with that main pass visible, I'm going to close that out. I'm going to press this eyeball render button right here. So press that to bring this window back up. Keep in mind that we've exported this image, but we've also kept it in Maya's temporary memory here, so we're safe to do another render. So now if I just go same thing as before, render, current camera 1 right there, and render that, we're going to get our diffuse layer rendering. And this one's going to take a bit longer than the ambient occlusion pass because it's going to have all those, that specular, the diffuse rendering is just a bit more complicated. So yeah, I'm going to let that go for a minute here. And in the meantime, I just want to quickly open up Photoshop and open that ambient occlusion pass that we did before. That's wrong folder. I put it under Images. I just want to make sure that this came out all right. So yeah, that looks okay. So image size, we have 2048 by 2048. So this is kind of a 2K render. If you can do 4K, you know, the bigger the better here. It just kind of depends on the power of your computer here. And you can see here that we have this alpha channel here, which is great. So if I create a new layer and then I do a paint bucket tool and then drag that behind the layer, you'll see you can put a photograph behind here, you can put any kind of image here. So depending on your scene, you know, if you have a forest or something like that, you can take like a, you know, an out of focus or in focus photograph of a forest and kind of composite it into the back of your scene here. So that's just going to open up a lot of flexibility for us later on here. Okay, so the ambient occlusion pass came out okay, and I'm going to pause here for a minute and let this diffuse or the main render pass render, and we'll check back in once this thing renders out. Okay, so the render finished. It looks like my render took about 12 minutes here. So this looks a little dark. Typically, I would probably consider re-rendering this with a little more light, but I don't know. Let's see if this works. In this particular instance. In this instance, I am kind of going for a little bit of like a Sleepy Hollow kind of gothic look here, so this might still work. So I'll press Keep Image to make sure that Maya saves it into its temporary memory here, and then in the render view, and now just go to File, Save Image, and I'm going to save this in the same place as a PSD as well, so I'm going to call this Stump Diffuse version 1, and save. And so now we're going to bring these into Photoshop and composite them here. Oh, you'll see here, that's the render from my last demonstration of this. So I'm just going to close that out. Okay, so this is the ambient occlusion, and I'm going to open up the diffuse layer here. So it should let me open that, even though it's grayed out for some reason there. Ooh, that's dark. Okay, so let's just see what happens if I boost up the levels here. Okay, this is still workable here. I'm not quite sure why this render came out so dark though. Okay, so for the ambient occlusion pass, I'm gonna just duplicate this layer over to the other side. So I'm just gonna right click and duplicate the layer, and then change it from the document from the ambient occlusion to our diffuse pass there. And so from here, this is the ambient occlusion. And so what you want to do with the ambient occlusion is it's white with these dark areas. So what we want is we don't want the light areas on there, but we want the dark. And so the best way to do this is under the overlay mode. Is normal is kind of what you should see right here. And we're going to just change this to multiply. And I'm just going to boost up the level. I don't know why the render came out so dark there. I'm just going to boost this up a little bit in my levels just to make it so we can see our work a little bit better. And so this is, I'm toggling off the ambient occlusion here. Then I'm going to toggle it on. Keep an eye out for shadows in this area, and then particularly kind of down here, right where my cursor is here. So I'm going to turn the ambient occlusion back on, off, on, off. So that's on. So it just kind of helps kind of bring the image into reality a bit more here. So in this render here, I have this alpha channel right there. And so one thing you can do is you can put any background you want back here. For this particular render, I designed it to be just a plain black background, but if you want to composite a scene in there, for instance, we could go to File, Open, and on my desktop, I think I put a star image on here to help demonstrate this. And so, you know, if you have a forest or a city kind of matte painting background that you want to be back here, just duplicate it over. And then okay, oops. And so to transform this, I'll press Command T, or you can go to Edit, see, Free Transform. And to scale it evenly, you don't have to press Shift or anything. I think you used to have to press Shift to scale it evenly. But, you know, you can put any background you want back here. You know, this looks pretty cheesy, what I'm doing right here, but I'm just trying to demonstrate the idea that you can kind of bring any background you want into here and then use the power of Photoshop to kind of composite the scene the way that you want, so that these things kind of blend together and meld as one image here. So I'm just going to turn that off, and instead I'm just going to press the paint bucket tool in black for this particular render, because that's kind of more the way I designed the scene. I can also press I on my keyboard or use the eyedropper tool and just kind of select an area that I want it to kind of blend from. And kind of work from there. And so from here, let's see here. So from here I have, let me just make this a little larger. So I have the stars layer that I was just kind of making to demonstrate that we can use the alpha channel to our advantage to kind of build up a scene. Oops. I have this black background layer that I just made. This is the main diffuse layer right here. And then I have the ambient occlusion, and then I did a levels pass just to punch this back up. Let's see here. And so you can just kind of use these to kind of build up your scene and use these two layers in conjunction to kind of get the scene the way you want. This ambient occlusion, one thing I forgot to mention, as I was a little distracted by the render coming out a bit dark, is with the ambient occlusion, you do multiply, and you almost never want the opacity to be at 100% here, whether you're compositing this in After Effects or Photoshop or any other program. Typically, usually you want it to be anywhere from 15 to 50 is kind of the usual range. Sometimes, I mean, for this one, you just do it by eye a little bit. This is one where I kind of like it to be a little higher here. So for me on this one, maybe something in the 60 range is kind of what I want. And you might just want to kind of continue to do some color correction here. So I might do a curves pass on top of my levels pass. And I like to use adjustment layers rather than working right on the layers, because these adjustment layers, they work non-destructively. And so you just kind of never lose your work using these. And you can also blend them a bit, which can be really nice. So for instance, let's just say that this, I kind of like this curve that I drew, but I just want it to be a little bit less. And again, you just kind of click on it, or double click right there on the kind of Ghostbusters kind of button right there, and it'll kind of pull, it should pull it up on your window here. But it works like just any other layer, where I can do the opacity of the adjustment layer and kind of blend it back to 0 or back up again, so that I can do a levels and a curves adjustment layer, make the adjustment, and then I can fade them in and out, similar to what we were doing earlier in Mudbox here. And we can even do like a photo filter pass here, something like that if we want it warmed up a little bit. And when I do a photo filter pass, I like to kind of boost it up to a kind of extreme setting and then choose. It's kind of interesting. Choose which way we want it to go. And I'm having a hard time deciding if I want this thing to be warm or cool. So that's kind of a decision for, that might take more time than a demo here, but just kind of doing these adjustment layers to kind of fine tune your image helps a lot. So just to kind of look back, my diffuse pass looked like this, which is way dark for some reason. And then if I pull my layers back up, you know, it kind of gets the scene kind of looking the way I want. And you're almost always going to need to make adjustments in Photoshop or your compositing software to get it perfect. Again, kind of opening up, this has been a few days since I did the demo, so I might have opened up the wrong project there, but if I look under, sorry, recent documents, yeah, I got a similar render as before. I guess this was from another demo, but you know, things change around pretty quickly here. Actually, I don't know, I kind of like this render we just did. So if this was a final project too, I kind of, since this is a demo, I didn't go the full way here. Like typically for this plane here, I have this edge showing up right there. Typically, I would rather have this line just go all the way across, you know, one kind of smooth line going all the way across there. So there's a few things I would do a little bit differently on this, but the process is shown here. So when this is done, just go File, Save, oops, I did File Save, I'm going to do File Save As, and save out your document, and then when it's time to turn it in, you can turn in a PSD, but it might be better to submit a JPEG. Keep a PSD version for yourself, for sure, but when you're sending it into the D2L, maybe just make a JPEG copy of whatever you create here. And keep in mind that the images need to be larger than 1024 by 1024. I make that parameter in the a guideline because I want this to be usable for you and kind of adding into your portfolio and things like that that you can use after this class is out. You know, it can continue to be useful to you in some way. And keep in mind, if you go to image size at the top, it shows you exactly what your render settings are here. So 2048 by 2048 is pretty good. I think 4K would even be a little bit nicer here because I am seeing like some of this detail is still like a little bit pixelated, but that's still pretty nice detail. And so 2K to 4K, kind of in that range, is kind of ideal here.